Hello and welcome to the Third Age Babylon 5 podcast. Today, we are still only two of us. Meike is still lost in hyperspace, or today I could say she stepped through the wrong wormhole, because today we are going to compare Stargate Atlantis and Babylon 5, or more specifically, the Wraith from Stargate Atlantis to the Minbari. And why are we doing that?
Yeah, that's an obvious question. It seems like a kind of odd choice, but in their premise, we feel like both of these alien species and their place in the universe is somewhat similar, but because these are two very different shows with very different sensibilities, they have a very different perspective on how this contact turns into a conflict and how this affects humanity. So this is what we are going to look at today. And full disclosure, this is the second time we are attempting this recording. We already had a nice discussion about this, but it was a little bit meandering in places. So for this time around, we've decided to have a little bit more structure in this. So the way we are going to do this is we are going to look at sort of the history in universe, both of Stargate Atlantis and Babylon 5, of how humanity interacts with this big alien species. And in each of these phases, we're going to have a look at how these two different shows handle it, and at times also how things might be different, what things we might learn if we start swapping around these perspectives and imagining how this might go.
One thing I would like to add is that before we look at all the history and all the interactions, I think we should mention that their aesthetics is kind of similar. And therefore you have, because of things that we are going to talk about soon, because of these similar aesthetics and some conflicts that we have, you might come to the point where you think humans had a similar emotional and psychological experience towards these two species in these two series. That's why we're doing this.
Definitely. So in each of these phases, we are going to look at both how they are presented, how they go story-wise, and what are sort of the themes that go into it. But before we do any of this, we already alluded to Star Trek and Stargate a few times on our episode discussions in Babylon 5, but let's talk a little bit about Stargate Atlantis, because, I mean, it's obvious that we really like Babylon 5. This is why we're doing the podcast on this, but of course, if we are thinking about discussing at length the Wraith in this podcast as well, we should give a baseline of how we feel about Stargate and Stargate Atlantis specifically, especially if we are going to be critical in places so that people have sort of an idea of where we're coming from.
Yes. Should I start?
If you want to.
Yes, I really like Stargate Atlantis, although I'm often very critical about certain things, because for me, Stargate Atlantis especially is a show that starts with such a strong premise, with such a strong atmosphere, and then I'm very disappointed in the writing in some parts, but I enjoy to watch it over and over again. I like how it takes off, I like the character dynamics, and the Wraiths especially are a fascination of me personally, also because they were my childhood nightmare. I don't really know why, but I was allowed or not allowed, but I watched a few episodes of the first season when I was just 10 years old, not knowing what I was getting into. And the Wraith still have this effect on me that if I see them on screen, I feel like they're right behind me, and that night I have trouble going to the toilet in the dark. So, yeah, they are my personal nightmares. I'm very, very fascinated by them.
And I mean, for me, it's a similar situation, as in the show is steeped in nostalgia for me. This is like one of the earliest big sci-fi shows that I remember watching. And this is kind of a two-edged sword, because on the one side, I really like this show. I love getting back to it. I've seen it many times. I've done one watch through with all the DVD specials and episode commentaries, really getting also into the behind-the-scenes stuff. So I am fascinated. But on the other hand, because I watched it when I was younger, in my head, I built it up as this like massive sci-fi saga, especially early on, where I wasn't watching the entire way through, but only the earlier seasons. And especially because this was my introduction to the Stargate universe. So also SG-1 for me was this mythical era before, with many more seasons, and I always made it out to be this massive thing. And I've read on like the fandom pages and stuff about all the cool things about the ancients that we learned in this previous show. And then when I got around to watching it, and when I watched the Stargate Atlantis again with the more less rose-tinted perspective, some of it felt a little bit disappointing, and I can't always shake this. And so having this episode discussion, or having these podcast discussions and alluding to Stargate all the time, for me is also a way of trying to regain this much more positive attitude, because I don't want to be bitter towards the show. I want to kind of embrace what they're doing, and so it's always fun imagining how things could have played out differently, but also what things there are already in the show that are legitimately just really interesting and cool, and just kind of learning to appreciate that a bit more. And yeah.
It's also the first show that we two watched together, Atlantis, I mean.
Yes.
Because when I was 23 years old, you had the idea of, hey, we could watch that again. And I still remembering the Wraiths and how they scared me when I was little was like, maybe do we have to? So yeah, it took me long to get over that.
It was an interesting challenge to start out with, definitely. So yeah, it's a special show to us. We really, really like it. And we wouldn't be talking about especially the Wraith if we didn't have like fundamentally a very great appreciation for them. So anything that comes after this, take with this in mind, that we are fans. This is why we are going on about it. And I mean, with Babylon 5 living through this resurgence right now, keep your fingers crossed that Stargate might eventually manage to do the same thing, because in a lot of aspects it's been in a similar place where the rights are held by companies that aren't super interested in picking it up again, and it's kind of in this production hell right now. And so it's hope that maybe, someday in the future there's going to be more Stargate to look forward to.
There even was something announced, but it died again. Yeah.
Multiple times. It's a shame. But okay, we already briefly alluded to this idea that the premise of these two big alien species is similar. So let's start going into this a little bit. And the first phase that we are going to talk about, sort of in the history of both universes, is pre-contact. So imagine humanity being new to the galactic stage, the Stargate Atlantis expedition arriving in the Pegasus galaxy, and obviously Earth Alliance having just won the Dilgar War, sort of going to exploring a little bit. And now you start getting the sense that there is something else out there. And in both shows, we only get brief glimpses of this, so this is probably going to be a shorter part. But there is this small time span where humanity is just becoming aware of the fact that there is something else out there. And maybe let's look at how the Minbari and the Wraith are presented before they themselves actually enter the scene. Should we start with Stargate or with Babylon on this one?
Let's start with Babylon.
Okay, with Babylon 5, we learn most of this, I think, in the beginning movie, where we get a little bit of the prelude to the Minbari War, and we see humanity here in a very, let's say, self-assured position. We are soon going to watch Deathwalker for the first time in our Season 1 watch-through, and there we get this little bit of backstory that humanity has been contacted by the Centauri, has taken its first steps on the galactic stage, and then was very, very successful intervening in this big war against the Dilgar. So humanity right now is really self-assured, really confident, goes out exploring, and they want to explore in an area where the Minbari are said to live. And they talk to their bestest of friends, which early on are the Centauri, which is wonderful knowing where these things are going to go. And the Centauri warn them that, we are a big empire, us ruled the galaxy and all that, but don't actually go to the Minbari. It's a very bad plan. They are dangerous, and if we've learned anything, it's leave them alone and they're going to leave you alone. And this is virtually all that we learn about them. They don't get any sightings of ships or such beforehand. This is sort of all the knowledge that humanity chooses to entirely disregard, and then just saunters off into the frontier and runs into Minbari for the first time.
Yes, and the first time they run into each other, there already is this interaction where the cat dies, right? That's like the first interaction between the two species, or the first noticeable interaction.
Exactly. So once we go into the contact, we can talk about how many ways this goes wrong. But let's switch over to Stargate a little bit, because I think in this part, there are still a lot of parallels here. I mean...
I mean, in Stargate, humans travel to the Pegasus galaxy looking for the ancients. They have found where the ancients went when they left Earth. But they already know that they don't know necessarily yet that the ancients came back, right?
Yes, this is something that they learn very early on once they are in Atlantis, but they don't know beforehand. Exactly.
Yes. So they find the old city of the ancients, Atlantis, and then they learn that the ancients actually are not there anymore. They have left the city because they stumbled upon an enemy that could defeat them, which should already worry the humans, because the ancients were so advanced. They had ascension, they built the Stargates, they were this big civilization that
yes.
could, So that should already be a warning.
Yeah, there you have kind of this parallel of, if the Centauri warn you of anything, if the Centauri are humbled by something, you should be worried. If the ancients are defeated by something, you should be worried. But I think it's notable that humanity in this part of the Stargate universe is in a similar position where, at this point in the main show, they haven't defeated the world outright yet, but they are in a point where it's not that scary anymore. So if a similar situation where humanity sort of on the galactic stage has advanced in the Milky Way galaxy enough that they kind of know what they're doing, have the first spaceships going around and such. So once again, this theme of like, okay, we are confident, we will go out there and, if best case scenario, made contact with the aliens, even though this idea very quickly gets sort of cut down.
Yes. And then there's the factor that the first really person that's still alive that tells them about the Wraith is the people, Taylor's people.
Yes.
What are they called?
Oh, that is a very good question. Arthusians.
And there we might have the problem that her people are not as advanced. So they really are not sure how seriously to take that knowledge, although it's very soon it becomes very clear that their practical knowledge about the universe, about how the world works, is worth a lot. And it is taken seriously. But there I think you have this step down of, okay, but if they tell me that, what does that actually mean? Because they live in tents.
There is, well, they live in tents, but there's also this idea that the Wraith for these people on the first planet have already passed into myth to a large degree. I mean, I think it's very interesting and notable that the first side of the Wraith we see is children playing as Wraith. Yes. So it's already gone from this era it's an imminent threat to it is something that children are taught about as a warning, but it's also not immediate enough that you can start being playful about this.
Yes.
And I think the pilot episode of Atlantis is actually very good at establishing a lot of how this ancient aspect of the Wraith is dealt with, that they aren't a constant threat, but that they're also something where it's not the case that if you leave them alone, they will leave us alone. But there is sort of this sense there is a balance in the Pegasus galaxy right now, where the Wraith are there, but they only come out culling when it's possible, and otherwise they are more of a hands-off approach.
Yes, and I mean, as Taylor puts it, if the Wraith have never set foot on your world, you should leave.
Yes.
Because if they don't know your world yet, you're lucky.
Yeah, it's the same idea of this. And to the credit of the Pegasus expedition, it's not that they don't want to, it's that they literally cannot go back. So for all the overconfidence that Earth as a whole has in the Stargate universe for this expedition, it's also just a matter of necessity. They don't really have a choice. And just to reiterate on this point, we go into the ruins, we see like the wall paintings of the Wraith, and we see that the knowledge that the Arthusians have is very practical, but also incomplete. Like there is this idea, if you set foot in the city of the ancients, the Wraith will awaken again. But then they themselves also immediately say, yeah, but we haven't put this to the test in a long time, obviously. So they are also aware of the fact that there is mythical knowledge and there's practical knowledge, and that these two aren't necessarily always the same. But, I mean, in both of these universes, this very quickly leads into the contact scenario. And, I mean, if we started out of Babylon 5, so in that situation, this is for a long time a big mystery how exactly this contact goes, but eventually what we can start piecing together is that ultimately the guy that gets chosen to lead this expedition into Minbari space is more of a hero of the Dilga more than a valiant explorer. So he isn't maybe the best person equipped for this, which, maybe this is similar to the colonel being the first one, to the colonel being the first one in sort of negotiating with the Wraith Queen. He's probably not the best person to do this. If there was any chance of peace, he probably wouldn't be the best one to take this. Not that there is much of that. But yeah, it essentially ends with humanity in Babylon 5 taking the shot, taking out a Minbari leader, Dukat, and immediately provoking this ravenous sort of vengeful reaction from the Minbari, where at this moment, immediately, the Earth-Minbari war is kicked off. There's not very much an in-between stage. This one mistake immediately escalates to this full-on conflict. And I think here we are going to see where some of the paths are diverging, because this reaction with the Wraith is the same. Obviously, the reasons are very different.
Yes, do we have the time? Can we talk about the reasons in Babylon 5 immediately for a moment?
Sure.
Because I don't quite remember, because it was a long while ago. But I mean, it doesn't just happen that you have 2 spaceships and suddenly someone dies.
Yeah.
There was it this thing that the warrior cast of the Minbari does, that they when they show you respect as a formality, they have their weapons out.
Yes.
Then so I remember correctly. So it was really just that the humans were not yet competent enough to deal with the situation, because it was really just a very great misunderstanding. And that is also a parallel to the first contact with the Wraith, I guess, because they had no idea what they were stepping into when they were rescuing people the Wraith had taken after they showed up, and still nobody had seen what they looked like. They just take people with their beamers, and that's it. And they start a rescue mission, not knowing what kind of being they are dealing with yet. And so, of course, from a human military perspective, it's a good idea to rescue your people and to, shoot someone who is in the way. It's just a problem that they kill a Wraith Queen, which has a consequence that everyone is waking up. I think in this episode, not even to the humans and also not to the viewers, it's clear what this dramatic everyone or all of them that the Wraith Queen is telling means yet. Because you could think, oh, maybe it's just this hive. Okay, they wake up, they don't have enough food, they go to sleep again, whatever. But yeah, it means that all the Wraith in the Pegasus galaxy are waking up, because this has never happened before, or not happened in a long time. So this means there's a new enemy, there's someone we don't know. And that's a problem, because now the Wraith are waking up and the balance in the galaxy is over, because all of these Wraiths that wake up need to feed.
Yes. And it immediately has this consequence where it triggers this immediate escalation into a full-on war. The Wraith are basically all waking up and storming back into Atlantis, picking up the war against the Ancients where they left off. But this also immediately creates this tension that will grow throughout the rest of the show, where all the Wraith being awake at the same time is a problem. This is not something that can be sustained forever. And in a way, I feel like this is not too dissimilar from what we see with the Minbari, where it is the snap decision of the Grey Council, initiated then by the Len, that they are going to go on this vengeful and holy war against humanity, and all of the Minbari are caught up in this war, and we also start seeing there over the course of the show, or in the aftermath of this war then, that this was a problem, that this is the first thing that really tips the balance of the Minbari that has held for 1,000 years out of kilter, where we see the warrior caste becoming very strong, having a lot of resentment about how the war ultimately goes, and this is never really resolved until we get into the Civil War, which both the Wraith and the Minbari do. I think it's interesting to question here a little bit in both cases, how inevitable is this war really? Like, if we imagine a different Hive Queen was there, maybe one that wasn't as dead set, seeing herself as the caretaker and awakening everything among her death, maybe one that only triggers this individual hive. Could we see this going a little bit differently, or was it always going to be the case that the Wraith are going to go into this feeding frenzy? What do you think?
It's a good question, because, I think Stargate Atlantis never really differs between the Wraith Queens that we see so much. So how much of a hive mind they actually are is in question, because you could think that a Wraith Queen only has telepathy with her own drones, but it looks more like they can access everyone. And since it's a new enemy, and since this Wraith Queen has just learned about Earth, more or less, I think under that situation, after having scanned the kernel, and having seen, oh my god, there are these humans, they have this big feeding rod, and they have Atlantean technology, I think it would be difficult to find a Wraith Queen who doesn't feel like waking up everyone.
Yes. I think there's something to this. I think it would have been interesting to see, maybe after the fact, that there is this sort of spectrum, that some of them are maybe more conniving and scheming, where you could imagine that maybe things would have gone differently. But on the other hand, it also kind of makes sense if they know Atlantis is in operation again. They don't know whether there is an actual ancient civilization behind this. I was just having this question because we know for a fact that with the Minbari War, there is a very strong possibility that things could have gone differently. Dylan has to break the tie in the Grey Council because they aren't united behind this and necessarily. They unite with her wrath, but there could be conceivably a different version where somebody else in the instead would have been more reserved, would have said, okay, no, let's step back and figure out what went wrong here.
There could have also been a human making first contact who wouldn't have interpreted the traditional Minbari greeting so aggressively. Like, I was just thinking, I mean, of course they sent someone from the military.
Sure.
But if they had someone else on board, like if we had someone like Dr. Weir on board, they could have maybe not fired first.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that I find very interesting, that of course we have this moment of sort of callous humanity exploring and being, very straightforward with this. But on both sides, we need to have sort of the right people in the right place and making the wrong decision in this case to really trigger this cascade scenario. All right, so the reasons for the war are very differently. We have sort of this holy war on the one side and this feeding frenzy on the other side. But how the war ultimately goes, at least in the beginning, is fairly similar. In both cases, we get the situation, this is the next phase that we're going to talk about, where humanity is hopelessly outmatched. In the beginning, this is sort of retold by Londo in this very heroic way, where humanity is sort of fighting back with everything they've got until there's only sticks and stones left. And I mean, to some degree, this is the case. We see on multiple occasions that humanity is really completely outmatched, has no chance even hitting the Minbari vessels, which is like, it's not even that their armor is too strong or human weapons are too weak. No, it's just we can't even touch them. They are so far beyond what we can do. And I mean, a very similar thing is the case immediately after everyone wakes up. You get the sense that the Atlantis expedition has 100, 200 people there, but then the hives us this like galaxy worth of people that have defeated the ancients, and without knowing anything else, this is immediately essentially a death sentence, despite all the cool technology that humanity gets to toy around with in that setting.
Well, I think it's more of a bad situation that could have gone on forever, because right in the beginning we learned that the ancients could have survived in Atlantis for much longer, as long as you have a ZPM to power the shield. But yeah, it's like, if you have enough energy, you can forever survive in the city, and the galaxy belongs to the Wraith, and that's just a situation you're stuck in the end.
Yes. I think what we talked about last time very early on, maybe this is a good opportunity to do this here, is apart from all the sort of material stuff of how this war is going, this is also the first thing that really starts taking a toll on human psyche, no matter which universe you're in. If you are in the Stargate Atlantis universe, sitting in Atlantis right now, you can just look at the hologram that talks about all these like unpredicted human colonies falling to the enemy, whereas in the Earth Minbari war, humanity lives through the same thing in real time, where one colony after another is lost, until it even gets to the point where the closest colonies to Earth are completely overtaken or just left by the wayside by the Minbari, because they are just so eager going for Earth. And this focus on Earth is also something that both the Wraith and the Minbari share, where they don't care so much about all the little bits of humanity that are around. They are really going for the main prize, either to entirely wipe it out or to feed on it in the process, wiping it out. And that has got to be something that humans have to deal with, right? Like, this has to be an immediately stress factor that starts building up towards this like very climatic conclusion in both cases.
Yes, I remember when we first started watching Babylon 5 that you took out one of the DVDs from later seasons and you showed me the sequence, the flashback to the last days of the Minbari War, to introduce humanity to me. Like, this is what humanity went through. You showed me that. That was very interesting. And yes, for me, the Pegasus Galaxy always had a fascination because you see all of these different humans, these different cultures that grow under this constant threat. To some, it is more evident, it is more there because they are culled more often. To some, it's really that everyone who's alive has once seen a culling and knows what the Wraith do to you. They suck out your life. They are the space vampires. And to some, it's more of a myth, and they grow more in numbers before the Wraith come back. But everyone knows it, and everything you do as soon as you set foot into the Pegasus Galaxy is under the threat of this absolute monster taking away your life in this most horrible way.
Yes.
So it's always a very, very strong feeling when you have a lot of funny interaction, you have a lot of lighter episodes, when you grow close with a lot of characters, all of this happens in the shadow of this.
And I think this is one of the points where I have much to learn when it comes to enjoying Stargate, because on some level I get, like, especially looking at the pilot of Stargate Atlantis, which we watched recently, you have this immediate comparison between the Colonel, who takes things very seriously, and he recites his number, his name, and engages with the first Wraith Queen in these very serious terms, and it doesn't work out for him at all. And then our hero character, John Shepard, comes in and he just doesn't take it seriously. And as much as I sometimes get annoyed by this as a character trait, it is a very human defense mechanism. If you are in this absolutely horrific situation, just make a joke about it. Just do not take it seriously. Refuse to engage with the Queen on the same level.
You mean like me when we watched this climate change video and I was like, oh, do you see her tattoo? That's cool. Which tattoo could I get?
It's infuriating, but on some level I have to recognize that, this is also like how humans deal with this kind of stuff. Which I think, due to the perspective that we get on the Minbari War, we don't really see that side of humanity very often. Like, it's either retold through London Malari as this very heroic tale of resistance, or as a result of the massive psychological stress that this war put everyone through, that basically every human character that we see is damaged by this in some way, carries this trauma.
We have Susan.
Yes. It's a different kind of humor, but it definitely is a way of dealing with this. But as we talk about this very terrifying phase of the war, maybe let's also talk a little bit about the aesthetics and the presentation of both the Wraith and to some extent also Minbari, because this was one of the main reasons we even got to the idea of making this episode, because we watched relatively recently, you might have seen the episode, And the Sky Full of Stars, where we kind of see the first glimpse through Sinclair's memories of what the Minbari were like, what they were seen like during the Earth-Minbari War, before anybody knows how they really look like, before anybody knows their religious and peaceful and wholesome side, when they are just this like unstoppable threat that is coming for Earth. And there are an astonishing number of parallels here between the Wraith and the Minbari, to the point where we were looking at this and thinking, I wonder what this war would have looked like from the perspective of a show like Stargate Atlantis, where you get to see this firsthand and this horror is really emphasized.
Yes. I think what the horror of the Minbari really is, and that is something that we as viewers in the Babylon 5 universe never get to experience. And it's a thing worth thinking about for a moment, that the writers decided not to put us through it, to have us introduced to the world where the Minbari are just humanoid beings that we can talk to, joke with, that are just there in their own way, and to not let us have this horror. Because what makes them so terrifying is that at the point when the Battle of the Line happens, no human has ever seen a Minbari, right?
Not officially. We do later get allusions to, people who took Minbari as prisoners and mutilated them and stuff, but even they are at this point so psychotic about it that it's not a normal interactions. And officially, most people, the people that are in the Battle of the Line, have no idea what they look like.
Yeah, and the people on Earth that just have this spaceships around their planet, they also have never seen one. And I think that is a big part of the horror, that you haven't seen them and that they have these spaceships that look like slugs, that look like they are a growth somewhere in the sky, and they have come to wipe out your species, basically. I think that really emphasizes the horror in that scene. And that also is kind of similar to what the Wraith put the humans through, because as a normal human being that just lives out their life in the Pegasus Galaxy, you never get to see the Wraith, really. You may know a little bit about what they look like from tellings, from some people that under very weird circumstances survived and made a legend or something. But what you see when a calling happens is that these little one-man spaceships that can beam you up and then take you to their spaceship to be eaten up. You see the darts, and that's it. And every few generations or whatever, a dart comes through the Stargate and just takes your people. And that's all you ever see.
Or if you are one of the planets that offers a little bit more resistance, you might get to see these massive and once again bluish, like just an unnatural color, unnatural shapes, these massive organic growths that are just there. If you got taken prisoner by the Wraith, you have seen these organic corridors and experimentation chambers, and everything about them is just, on one hand, very much more advanced, but also not quite technological anymore.
Yeah, it looks grown, and we see also in Stargate Atlantis later that they actually grow their spaceships. It's a kind of growth. And I mean, the Minbari don't have organic technology yet, but they are the closest of our species. So that's also a parallel.
We see later on, once they start building the white stars, that they can get to the point of regenerating hulls and stuff with a little bit of help from the Warlords. So they are definitely the closest there. And even if it's not organic technology quite yet, they are very clearly fashioning themselves after this, which is just very unsettling. It's once again, worlds away from what human spaceships look at the time, where they are almost these like near-futuristic ones that aren't too far away from spacecraft that we imagine today.
But there's one more parallel, actually, when you just look at how they are presented, because I had to think of the Wraith before this episode when we first watched Babylon 5, if you remember. Because when we watched one of the first episodes, and Dylan was just there, and I saw her face and I heard her speak. I mean, after the pilot in Babylon 5, Dylan doesn't have this effect on her voice anymore. She doesn't have this voice that comes from all directions and sounds weird, because it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
But in the first trial, they even still had this enhanced voices, and then just that you have a face that doesn't look too alien, but it somehow does, because when you look at the Minbari, you don't feel like you look at an alien that might have had just another kind of origin, because I know it's also not correct biologically, but if you look at the Narn, my first idea is maybe they just come from reptiles, so they are just high intelligent reptiles, so they don't have this scary unhuman effect on me. They just don't look human, and that's fine. And the Minbari kind of have these faces that are human but wrong.
Yeah.
And that is really terrifying. And that is what they have in common with the Wraith, because there you have a human face that just has these features that you have never seen before, and that makes them so scary.
Exactly. And this is something, if we just look at also the Wraith and Minbari as creature designs, to call it that, they entirely fall into this area of the uncanny valley. And this starts by the point where the first Minbari humans get to see out of the Grey Council of the Grey Hoods, where they are just vaguely humanoid figures without any distinguishable features. The first Wraith that you are likely to see are the drones that have these like organic masks where you can't exactly tell, is this part of your arm or is this part of your body? Like, what is this even? And this just extends further through. If you take off the mask, if you take off the hoods, then you have these like uncanny faces. Everything about them falls into this not quite human, not quite alien area, which then also very much fits their behavior. For humanity, one of the big shocks about the Minbari War is that it doesn't make sense. You had the first contact that went wrong, but now it's just this entirely zealous war against us. That is not normal. Like usually you would expect, maybe a second chance or anything like that. And there's just nothing like that. Any appeal for like a capitulation right up until the Battle of the Line is just not heeded in any way. Every negotiation attempt just fails very early on. And to some extent, this is also something for the Pegasus expedition, where they are in this new galaxy and they have this enemy that just doesn't behave like anything they know from the Milky Way. Like this whole culling thing, the way that they teleport people, the way that they feed on them, none of this makes sense. And all of it is right in this area where, okay, they look like humans, but they can't really eat. They need to suck your life force out of it. They speak, but very rarely in the beginning. And if they do, they have this uncanny voice. They have weird telepathic abilities, which we aren't quite sure. They are very insectoid in general, which is strange. And so all of this comes together to create this sense of an alien species that is too close for comfort and at the same time utterly unpredictable.
Yes, and I just remember when I was little and I looked into these faces, I think it was, I think in the first 2 or 3 seasons we have one actor who plays all of the Wraith that have a face, who is very good at it. Just his eyes, you see hunger, you see playfulness. He just looks mad.
Mad and also massively enjoying what he does.
Yes, and it's just so, I just looked into this face and oh my God, it was such a horror. Just this horror. Just looking into these eyes, it was overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Do we want to go one step further into the conflict? Because what does humanity do when this conflict quickly turns into an existential threat? And in both universes, this is something that happens quite early on. Well, we get into this stage of super weapons, I've called it in the notes here, where in both cases, humanity does manage to get some victories. And in both cases, this victory consists in destroying either a flagship or some of the mothership of the Wraith. And this is in both cases achieved through good old nuclear weapons. Like this one ultimate weapon that humanity has developed and which is heralded as sort of harnessing the power of the universe. It's sort of the last resort that humanity can employ, and it does so. In the case of Stargate, it's also in conjunction with their teleportation, the transporter technology that they've gotten from the Asgard. So sort of all the high-tech and brute force that humanity can put together is put to use against the Wraith, and it is successful against the first attack, but then also very quickly becomes less useful because the nukes are very limited resources, and the Wraith start developing remedies against this. And of course, in Babylon 5, we have famously Sheridan the Starkiller, who employs some very infuriating tactics for the Minbari, where they see it as highly dishonorable that he mines an asteroid field and blows up one of their main capital ships. So we get into this situation where humanity has some new super weapons that it can use to its advantage, but those are symbolic victories. They're not ever going to be enough to win this war. What I find very interesting, just as a side tangent, is that in Stargate, this is sort of the approach that the ancients also take. And this is one of the first times, also for the Atlantis expedition, where this idea of the ancients as these very superior and highly advanced and highly wise people gets broken up, because you start noticing the more they explore the Pegasus galaxy that one of the reasons that the Atlanteans lost was that they were very bad at fighting a conventional war. They were building more and more of these super weapons and special projects and more powerful weapons up to the point where one of it blows up and an entire solar system is gone. But none of these were successful in winning a conventional war, because that's ultimately not what these kinds of weapons are good for.
Yes, but that also shows that they had not much experience with it.
Yes.
Because in the world in which they grew over, in the galaxy in which they grew over millions and millions of years, that was just never necessary. It was never necessary to lead such a war. And it's interesting now that you mention it, because in the Pegasus galaxy we learned that they were very bad at fighting a conventional war. In the Milky Way, we have already learned that their whole civilization collapsed because of a virus. Yeah, so what kind of basic threat to their civilization could they have actually survived?
They seem very... I mean, this is not something that I want to go on about too long, because it's very easy from like this wide perspective to say, yeah, they were just very bad at things that they did, but let's just assume there's more to it, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt with that.
Yeah, sure, but it just piled up interestingly in my head at the moment.
Absolutely.
What I would also like to add here, because we were talking about many of the things, you have this phase, at least in the Pegasus galaxy, where you find mistake after mistake after mistake the ancients made, up to a point where you have this race that kind of, it has been a while since I watched that episode, it's later on in the show, but you find a Wraith who has his own breeding station that is powered up by a lot of ZBMs that he found because the ancients just left stuff around. I mean, not on purpose, of course, but because it got hectic and, just really, left power sources out there for the Wraiths, all of these kind of mistakes. And I found it interesting that at some point it is always hinted that, it looks like the Wraith came after the ancients. So that this narrative that you find right in the beginning of, oh, we stumbled upon a sleeping enemy, you start questioning it. Did they actually stumble upon a sleeping enemy? Did they find the sleeping enemy? Did they make the sleeping enemy? Because we know that they are interested in power sources and having this human being that can, like this bug that they evolved from, that can store energy and give it back again, because Wraith can do that. They can suck out your energy and they can give it back to you. Leads to the question, are the Wraith just one of the big mistakes the ancients made? Did they create it and lost control? And it is never actually confirmed that it happened like that. But it's an idea that I like, and I think the hints at that are interesting.
Yes, and it's interesting because you never know how much of this is intentional with Stargate, unfortunately. Because the way that it's laid out here in the very beginning is this idea that the ancients have settled the entirety of the Pegasus galaxy, and then they stumble upon one planet, wake up an enemy, and are immediately outnumbered, which just in no scenario adds up. So, and I mean, this is not necessarily a flaw in the writing. This, for me, is just telling, okay, the ancients are telling a slightly idealized story of what happens. And I mean, they've been there for millions of years. Maybe they looked away from this planet for a million years, and suddenly there's so many bugs there that they can't control it anymore. Who knows? But certainly there is this possibility that this is just one of the many experiments where they were, where even the ancients were messing around with energies that were beyond what they can really control. And so many of these super weapons are abandoned in the end because as they got desperate, they were messing around with stuff that they couldn't really control. Which brings us right back to humanity in the Babylon 5 universe, but because it has the same habit later on when we see them messing around with shadow technology early on and with other organic technologies, we know if humanity would have been in the ancients that they would have done exactly the same mistake, very possibly. Which is also one of the parallels I really enjoy, that both Stargate and Babylon 5 take a very similar approach to imagining future humanity in this sort of grayish area. But during the Minbari War, what humanity engages in is bioweapons research. We learned from Franklin that they call any person that had any extended contact with aliens, especially medical scientists, and just call in all the data that they can get in the hopes of developing a bioweapon. Which is interesting because we never learn if that project had any kind of progress. It's hard to believe that every single scientist did the same as Franklin did and said, no way, I'm not going to give you any of my notes. So who knows, maybe humanity had like a bunch of bioweapons ready, so in the case that the Minbari actually tried invading Earth, humanity just, I don't know, starts releasing all kinds of viruses on itself and them. But it's an interesting parallel because the same thing happens with the Atlantis expedition as well, partially because their resources are very limited, partially because this is the one oddity that they find is that they get this fixed idea that somehow you can biologically deal with the Wraith in some way, whether it is creating a retrovirus that enables Wraith to eat normally and just disables their feeding frenzy, or if it's something that outright turns them human, which is very interesting because knowing everything we know about the Minbari, it's kind of an open question what would have happened if humans had ever found out, and if it's even possible for them to find out that, similar to the Wraith, the Minbari also have some human characteristics in them.
And the Minbari have this machine that can turn you into a kind of trans species, yes.
And I mean, it's difficult to say because the Triluminary, which is this machine that initiates Chrysalis, is part of this time loop, and there is some technology from the Great Machine in there, but looking at the probe itself, what it's based on is just Sinclair's communicator. So we don't actually know how hard it is to recognize that there's human DNA in the Minbari. If it's literally about DNA, which it should be because Sinclair had children, then that can't be this hard. I mean, nowadays we can map the human genome. How hard can it be to recognize some alien genes in there?
But how many children did Sinclair have? I mean, I think it's still like you have to find these few people that have like these 2 or 3 genes that are so specific.
I mean, as we go into our first big sort of alternate reality history telling here, we should emphasize This isn't to say this is a very feasible scenario that would have worked out for humanity very well in the end, but just because it's a nice parallel, I love to imagine what if humanity at the height of the Minbari War somehow gets enough data on the Minbari to figure out, oh my god, there is something human about them. And it doesn't need to be precise, it doesn't need to be a successful chrysalis. All that it would need to be is any kind of hint that there's a biological connection between the Minbari and humans. And humans are medically advanced enough to know that this isn't the case between them and the Centauri. So we know this is something that they've been working on before. Because if humanity figures this out, given how the Minbari react to the chrysalis and to the revelation that the souls are sort of mixed in between the two species, if any of these revelations came about on the battlefield because humans have deployed some kind of biological weapon, I reckon the chances are pretty high that this would have thrown the Minbari into utter pandemonium. Probably not going to work out very well for humanity. It probably gets bombed to hell in revenge for these experiments anyway. But I feel like a good chunk of the religious class would have lost it immediately and then given up on the war, and then everything would have devolved into some kind of big civil war.
Yes, I think actually my understanding of this saying, or saying it in the Minbari way, saying our souls are reborn into humans, is their super religious spiritual way of saying we have an idea that something like this is the case.
Yeah.
You would kind of have a part of us, and that's when they stopped the war immediately, shortly before winning. So that's definitely what they did.
Yeah.
And I mean, for the humans, if they found out, they would have probably liked to stop the war, but could not. They would have needed to give the information to the Minbari, because I mean, that's like if you think of how we work differently, how we work on viewing the Neanderthals differently, because we find out, oh, we have so many genes from them, they cannot have been these wild monsters that we thought they were.
Yeah,
that would have been the effect.
It's definitely interesting to showcase that also for humans this kind of stuff matters, which in a way is odd. Like, why would your perception of the Neanderthal change so much if you learn, 2 to 4% of me is them? Like, that doesn't really change your daily life anymore.
I mean, we made it like several thousand years ago. That apparently that matters.
Just like it matters that Sinclair had a bunch of children. So there you go.
Yeah, I think it's just in Babylon 5. It's just this. I mean, we have this character that leaves her own species to become part of another species in parts. So to stand between two species, two races, two cultures, two nations. And I think we see a lot of playful stories about that in Babylon 5, about who am I, who are the others, why do the others matter to me, what do we have in common, and how separate from each other are we actually. That's kind of the main point of the story, which is interesting because in Stargate you could open up a lot of similar plots, a lot of similar stories, which the potential is there, but they go different ways.
Let's start with the potential first before we go into some of the details, because we will have to talk about Todd and Michael. These are crucial characters. But this whole scenario, if we imagine how it would go in Babylon 5, one of the reasons that seems so plausible to me is because I look at Stargate Atlantis, and that's essentially what happens. Humanity starts messing around with the identity, with the genetic makeup of the Wraith, and this becomes a major part of conflict, not only between humans and the Wraith, but also among the Wraith themselves, because there is this massive question of how do you even view them, and with the Wraith it even goes so far that at some point they almost get treated like it's a disease, like being a Wraith is a disease, even though they are legitimately half bug, half human, and nobody is there to decide that the human half is the real one. But there is definitely this big element. It's one of the things where I'm slightly iffy on in Stargate Atlantis, that we focus this much on the biological angle, and it in cases feels like it kind of pushes the show into a corner that it doesn't necessarily want to be in. But it definitely still gives us also the sense that both in Babylon 5 and Stargate, this attempt to go further into superweapons, developing a definitive answer to the war in the shape of a bioweapon, doesn't end up working. For the humans, it fails very early on, in part because humans just ethically have too much against this, But also, the same kind of ethics question pop up in Stargate Atlantis, where people start really questioning if it's the right thing to do to introduce this retrovirus and such. And ultimately, it's also not something that leads to a final conclusion to the conflict.
Yes, the problem that we practically have with the retrovirus is that we have two viruses we can talk about, which is interesting because the first one that we have is the one where humans become like Wraith cannot feed on us anymore. That it stops the feeding process, which also is risky because I think it was like half of the humans that get that injection die.
A significant portion, yeah.
A very big portion. But the Wraith, of course, don't let human herds live that they cannot feed on anymore, so they just kill everyone.
They could have seen that coming, I feel like.
Yeah. And then we have the retrovirus that turns Wraith into humans, and there is the problem that you need to get the injection very regularly. If not, you turn back into a Wraith and you lose all of your memories. So that's a problem. Imagine if you have to give that to someone every 2 days, or otherwise they start eating you. And then we have this phenomenon that Michael had so many injections that he got stuck in an in-between stage.
Yes.
So that are the practical problems. The other problem that I see here is that, it never really leads to any kind of solution or to any kind of interesting conflict. Although when we had the Wraith Queen that came all over and said, we want to become humans because we don't want to have the feeding problem anymore, that got me. That was interesting.
Yes.
But yes, I think what from that point on becomes more and more and more is to take away the horror of the Wraith and to concentrate on their human core, to really picture them as they are humans who have a genetic makeup that they just have a food supply problem, basically. So what are the right supplements for the Wraith so that they are not dangerous anymore? You can go down that route. But I don't know if the whole concept of them that we are introduced in the beginning, I find it an odd choice to take all of the horror away, to say the least.
And I think this then once again feeds also in our perspective on Babylon 5, where I think a good chunk of the reason why we only get to experience the Minbari as this pure horror secondhand is because otherwise it would cause exactly this problem. Like trying to turn them then into a sympathetic species isn't impossible, but it would also kind of feel like a loss because they are such great villain in the previous scenario. And I think this is a little bit what we see with the Wraith as well, where of course you're rooting for humans to win, but on the other side, and if it just means turning the biggest threat of the Pegasus galaxy into more humans, that's kind of a shame. And at least for me personally, this is also something that I think I just am not the biggest fan of how much Stargate sort of neatly resolves all of its big baddies in the end like this. Although, if we start talking about resolutions, and we are getting into this territory, let's talk a little bit about how these conflicts end, because especially like you just described, in the Pegasus galaxy, it doesn't really. It just turns into this very messy situation where eventually the Pegasus expedition decides to pull out and bring Atlantis back to Earth, in part to protect it from the still angry Wraith that are now, with the ZPNs, have the ability to cross the intergalactic void. So there it's not really a clear solution, and for humanity in the Minbari world feels much the same way, where sure the Minbari capitulate, but now you are left with this massive mystery that isn't really resolved, and still this massive trauma that is around. And I think in both settings we can start talking about this a little bit, because especially if we start talking about people like Michael who get stuck in between, there is a big problem why he cannot easily go over to the human side, is that the humans will have a very hard time accepting that after everything they went through.
Yes, and because you have the feeding problem, right?
That also, yeah. So with the Wraith, there is still this like fundamental issue that you can't really reconcile with the Wraith without taking away a core aspect of their being, except if you would somehow have an arrangement where they don't take all your life away, where you donate years to make that happen.
Yes, or in the end, they also reset some of the feeding process to make it less scary. We see that when we are introduced to Todd, with whom I think Shepard has this soldier story where two enemy soldiers work together to get out of it. Yeah. whatever. And I think if they don't suck all of your life out of you, if they stop at the right moment, you can even completely recover. And there, I think they missed an opportunity, because if we have these space vampires that you can kind of donate your lifetime to, and then you can recover, you could have a lot of interesting or psychological, personal stories between Wraith and humans that kind of go into a symbiosis that is highly dangerous. And
Yes.
I always imagined that if Stargate Atlantis would have went on, if there would have been 5 more seasons or more movies, that would actually something to explore. Because they definitely had made the choice of showing someone like Todd, who is super funny until he wants to shake your hand. His hand he can kill you with. So I think that was something that I wanted to explore. I have to think of vampire novels. There are actually some good ones. I have to think of vampire novels that are not Twilight, where you have these dynamics. But yeah, that is one side you can go if you want to take the horror away, I guess. But then you have to really deep dive into it. And I think for me, what satisfies me is that if the show would have went on, that would have been definitely something they would have gone for.
But I also think this is an area where it becomes very difficult to tell these kinds of stories. There are good examples of this, but you then have to strike this perfect balance of making them more approachable, but also, on the one hand, you're taking a lot of this horror away to allow for a normal relationship between a species like the Wraith and humans, but at the same time, you're also now confronting more humans with Wraith at first hand, which can lead to all these psychological tensions that are interesting to explore, but also very difficult to explore.
Yes.
And I think a similar thing we do see in Babylon 5, which I think, if comparing Wraith and Minbari is an odd one, then the oddest tangent that we can go on is comparing Michael and Delenn. But I think there is something there. We did this last time as well, where Delenn also becomes this person in between, inadvertently. She has a very different idea of what chrysalis means than what it actually does to her. She doesn't quite understand what it does to her body. She doesn't quite understand what it does to her standing in society. And on Babylon 5 itself, usually this isn't as big of a problem, because she is in an environment where people are much more open to interact with her in this capacity as a bridge builder. But in the episode Gropos, we see when there's humans from Earth or just outside of Babylon 5 seeing this person, rightly so, some of them have a very negative reaction to it, because she is, as a reporter from ISN puts it, she is sort of starting to look like the people that she was responsible for almost committing genocide on. So there is something to that this psychologically is going to mess people up very much if they're confronted with it without any warning.
Yes. I think what the big difference between Todd and Delenn, the biggest difference there is that...
Michael.
Yeah, the biggest difference between Michael and Delenn is that Delenn does it voluntarily. She has a completely different idea of what is going to happen to her, but she does it completely voluntarily, while Michael is actually a Wraith that they just randomly capture, who hold as prisoner, and try a completely new virus on against his will that completely deprograms his whole body.
Yeah.
Which is like, yeah, I mean, that Stargate also opens up, I think, thing that we have to talk about, because it's like, this is a war crime. You don't do that to anyone. And here we have a Wraith who is pictured more and more as a speaking, talking, intelligent being that has a feeding problem. But there also is the question, is that really... That is obviously something that they wanted, but they could have played around with it more. How intelligent is one single Wraith? Is he intelligent without his hive? It could also have been that he cannot speak or think much without his hive, because they have this telepathic network, and if he's out of it, what is still left? They decided to go the full human part with him then, but that is also, there would have been more options. But yeah, here we have someone who is experimented on involuntarily. I mean, he wants to eat us, but he's still a being.
I mean, it's this thing where... I think sometimes the writer of Atlantis also make it very convenient that the Wraith are always just alien enough that you can, have one in your cell and torture by not feeding, which is something that they go on very early on. But of course, it becomes kind of a problem in retrospect when you start recognizing, oh no, if our end goal actually is some kind of coexistence and we're steering more and more towards this, we are going to have some difficult things to explain on how we arrived there. That is an issue. that is something that is hard to resolve. And maybe this is a situation where we can go a little bit into a second big alternate scenario. What would have to happen for this to work out better? What would have to happen for somebody like Michael who gets stuck in between to actually have the sort of environment that Dylan gets, where he maybe can function as this bridge between humanity and Wraith? And one possibility that I think we both always wanted to see is Atlantis becoming a place more akin to Babylon 5. It's a giant city. It can float in space, put 250,000 people on the spinning 5-mile-long station, just collect people from all the different civilizations that are in the Pegasus galaxy, and see what happens if you actually try to have them interact with it. Invite the weird-ass people that had an arrangement where they were like offering tributes to the Wraith and eating with them on some occasions and stuff, and like talk to these people and figure out, okay, how the heck did you figure out this deal, and why can't we make a better deal than this? Like, come on, people, there has to be an option.
Yes, as I said last time, I'm not sure I can say much to this, because obviously I would like to see the city more populated. I would like to see more diplomacy, more interaction between all of these cultures that you find in the Pegasus galaxy. But as the offset of the Wraith is as it is, I don't think I like to go this full human route to take away all of the horror and to really be on this level of, we have a food problem. Do we have the right supplements yet, doctor? Do we have vegan race? I mean, they're basically vegan if they don't eat humans anymore. They take pills and they don't eat the food that they're used to. I don't like to go that route with that Wraith. I would really not like to have an ambassador of the Wraith. I would like to have the Wraith as the horror. And yeah.
So I think then it's fair to say what you would like to see more of is sort of the second to last episode of Stargate Atlantis. We have the lone Wraith that is undercover on Earth, and just this last very badass hurrah for them, where he is this very scary entity in an environment that is not used to him.
Where he is among metalheads and is not noticed. Yeah, yes, I like exactly.
that. I mean, I do love, as much as I might go on about the writing that I don't much appreciate in the latter seasons of Stargate Atlantis, I love that before the end they decided to show one final time in an extremely memorable episode that the Wraiths still have the potential to be this. They can immediately return to this. And I wonder I wonder if any kind of this potential is still in the Minbari as well. I mean, in a way, Babylon 5 does the same by giving us in the beginning, very late in the show's production run, where we once again get to see the Minbari at the height of their power in this capacity. But with the Minbari, we see that their transition from this monstrous alien entity towards something human, I think is much more convincing, right? Like we are in favor of this. We like to see them on Babylon 5. And I think a lot of this goes also to the point that the internal conflict that the Minbari have after the war ends is just as big as the one that humans have, and it also gets resolved in this almost civil war that they have, and Narn finally, as stand-in for the warrior caste, sort of appreciates what has happened and sort of reconciles with the rest of the Minbari and humanity at the same time. And I think this is something that the Wraith would have needed. Like, if we want to kind of go this route more that Stargate Atlantis tries to go in, I think rather than just having all the different cultures of the Pegasus galaxy that we already see, it would have helped if we saw different Wraith cultures as well, more differentiation between the hives, and then maybe the spectrum of would have made more sense of people like Todd existing, but also very scary ones.
Maybe.
If at all.
If at all, yes. But maybe we don't need that at all.
No. I mean, this is ultimately where two different shows, and I think Atlantis ultimately doesn't need to go in this direction, of course.
Not with the Wraith, because I think what we have to memorize here is that with the Minbari, we just have someone who is very scary through appearance and through first contact and through all of their secrecy. But even before they had contact to humans, they had not such a different way of life. Are they mammals?
I mean, we never see one lay an egg, so I'm gonna assume yes.
I'm assuming that there are mammals as well. So we have basically super intelligent mammals that have speech, that have emotions, that develop technology, that have an old civilization, and we just met the wrong way for the first time. And there's this horror of a war, which I mean, nowadays we live in a very globalized world, but we could come up with examples from human history where other humans seem so strange to us. An invasion, like
Surely.
when I think of the late ancient time before the medieval time started, of the Huns showing up here and there in Europe and just burning your stuff down. They were scary, and they looked slightly Asian, which was not so often to see in Europe at the time. So, on that level, but, in the end, we're all humans. And that's kind of a thing that we have with the Minbari. And with the Wraith, we have the potential of a monster that is truly a monster for nightmares.
Yeah. I think this brings it to a very good point with Minbari. This revelation we are all human in the end, or all just sentient beings in the end, makes complete sense because it's built in from the very beginning. Whereas with the Wraith, it's like Michael, sort of stuck halfway in the middle, where you can't really commit to that because that removes so much of their essence, but at the same time, so much of the development hinges on the fact that we kind of get to this place.
Yeah.
I don't think this is a conflict we can entirely resolve. I don't think we want to resolve this entirely. These are two different shows. If anything, this is the reasons why just talking about Babylon 5 is not going to tell us everything about Stargate Atlantis. So who knows? Maybe one day we will have to talk about Atlantis some more. I know for a fact that Meike is very, very interested in this show. So definitely for a special or two, who knows, maybe even a full-on run at some point in the distant future. But for now, if we were to try and draw a conclusion from this, other than the fact that in some interesting places they look kind of similar, I think in our first discussion we already got to the point where we said, okay, so there is definitely a similar premise there. There are a lot of parallels of how this conflict and contact come about in the beginning, but then with the core motivation of the conflict, it begins diverging. And even though we continue to see interesting parallels right down to individual characters that take on similar roles, there is this fundamental difference in how these two go. And I think they're kind of indicative also of what these shows are ultimately about, what they're trying to focus on.
I would say that the emotional experience and the psychological impact the first contact has on humans is very similar in both shows. But then in the end, we have a completely different problem, a completely different written species.
Yes. And also very, very different ways of dealing with the trauma that this entire thing deals with. Unfortunately for the Pegasus Galaxy, a lot of this trauma just isn't dealt with because it is so old to this point that so many of these cultures could not sort of take away the trauma that the Wraith incurred without losing a lot of the identity that makes their cultures theirs. Which I think in a way is also true to some degree if we sort of map Pegasus Galaxy cultures changed by the war against the Wraith to characters changed by the war against the Minbari in Babylon 5. I think also there are a lot of cases we see that some of the psychological problems that people have incurred as the result of the Minbari war cannot be entirely resolved. They will not get over it, except for Sinclair, who just turns into a Minbari, and I think he's fine. But other than that, these are just some scars that continue existing, and they're just on such a different, larger scale in Stargate Atlantis that it just shapes so much.
And in the end, as you already said, it's about something entirely else. In Babylon 5, it's a story about different cultures, different nations, different ways of being, having so much in common because we're all intelligent developments of
the universe.
The universe. Having to overcome our phobia of each other, having to see what we have in common, having to overcome wars and racism and fascism and whatever, and having to work together for that, and for that going out of our comfort zone and see what we have in common and become this state where we influence each other so much on the station that we become something new, that we become a new unit that is connected. I mean, that's what it is about, also as a metaphor for politics and for conflicts and wars that we have on Earth right now. Definitely. Well, Stargate Atlantis is a very good horror story, I'd say, and plays differently psychologically with this human and not human, I think.
It does.
It doesn't want to make a political comment on necessarily on anything, but it is more of a psychological play with horror, with fear.
Very much so.
Yeah.
As you mentioned political comments, there is one aspect of this that we touched on in the first discussion. I don't think we're going to do this here. We are going to keep this maybe for another discussion later on. But I think at some point in the future, it will be worthwhile taking an even closer look at how humanity is portrayed in these two settings, because we touched on this a little bit in our first discussion, that what we see in response to the Earth Minbari War in Babylon 5's humanity, this shift into rampant xenophobia, this obsession over the mystery that the war left behind, and then ultimately the Clark regime, maybe this is what I have always wanted in Stargate, which is a good reasoning for the decision to keep the Stargate program as long as a secret as it is here. Because so often it's kind of just cited as, oh, people will lose their minds if they know there's a potential alien invasion. And, you know, so many people already believe in an imminent threat of an alien invasion. Is it really going to make this much of a difference? No, but on a serious note, like, I think this angle of saying, no, it's not about that people would lose their mind. We just know that humans have a way of politically overreacting to bad news that we kind of want to avoid here. That could be a really interesting thing. And, you know, maybe this is something that we will discuss with Meike at some point. Yes, but for now, I think this was a pretty well guided and fruitful discussion on these two alien races.
Yes, I'm going to be very busy tonight because already now I look so often into this direction because we have a picture of us here, because whenever I talk so much about the Wraith, I feel like they're right behind me, but there's not a Wraith.
No, just outside the window, so it's fine.
So anyway, and this is going to be a very busy night.
Yes, but before you start hiding in the closet, maybe we can start with the little outro section.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do we have an outro?
Of course we have an outro. As usual, we will be here next week. Very likely, most likely with Meike, because she is very eager to get back to the show, and despite all the busyness, making her way through hyperspace or the right wormhole as soon as she possibly can. And next episode, if I am not entirely mistaken, we are going to talk about Deathwalker.
Yes, the next episode will be Deathwalker. I'm very looking forward to it because it's very interesting. Yes, you can find us on Facebook. We have an own Facebook group. You can find us still on Twitter, although I'm working on a Mastodon account as soon as I have the time. We are also on Instagram and on YouTube, of course, and you can find us everywhere under the name Third Age Podcast. And if you like what we talk about, like and share. If you really liked what we talk about, and yeah.
As always, we're also very interested in any kinds of interactions, any kinds of opinions. If you want to yell at us for bringing Stargate into Babylon 5 podcast, if you want to talk about how much you love Stargate and give us different perspectives to look at it. If you're excited about more specials like this one, let us know. Otherwise,
you just found us cute.
Yes, of course, that too. Of course, this episode and any other future episodes you will be able to find here on YouTube, and also pretty much anywhere you get usually your podcast from. So Apple, Amazon, Google, Spotify, all of these places are linked in the description below. We are very much looking forward to seeing you next week.